The sun bled out across the western rim of Juniper Gulch, painting the undersides of the dust clouds in bruised shades of orange and purple. Holt Mercer felt the day's end in his bones, a familiar ache that settled deep, a companion to the silence that was the primary crop of his life. He led his horse, Balthazar, through the cracked, thirsty throat of Bitter Creek Arroyo, the water little more than a memory staining the stones. The wind was a restless thing, picking at the brim of his hat and whispering lies about rain. It was this same wind that carried the first sound that didn't belong to the landscape, a sharp, splintering crack followed by a low, frustrated curse that was almost stolen before it reached him. He reined Balthazar to a halt. Up ahead, where the arroyo curved toward the old wagon trail, a buckboard sat at a crippled angle. One of its rear wheels was shattered, the axle digging a furrow in the dry earth. A figure was bent over it, wrestling with the wreckage. The figure was slight, wearing a duster and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed their face completely. Holt wasn't a man given to meddling. Solitude had taught him that most troubles belonged to the folks who owned them. But the sun was dying fast, and the high desert was no place to be stranded after dark. Coyotes were the least of one's worries. With a soft click of his tongue, he urged Balthazar forward. As he drew closer, he saw it was a woman. Her hands, covered in thin leather gloves, were stained with grease and grit as she tried in vain to leverage a piece of splintered wood from the hub. "Looks like that wheel's seen its last turn." "Ma'am," Holt said, his voice raspy from disuse. She started, whirling around. The hat kept her face in shadow, but he could see the determined set of her jaw. She was clutching a heavy wrench like a weapon. "It'll turn again if I have anything to say about it." Her voice was clear, educated, and held no trace of panic, only a steely annoyance. Holt swung down from his saddle. He was a tall man, built of long, hard lines, with eyes the color of a winter sky that had seen too many seasons of drought. "Respectfully, ma'am, that axle is split. You could talk to it from now until the spring thaw, and it won't mend itself." He gestured with his chin toward the ruined wheel. "You're losing the light." She finally lowered the wrench, her shoulders slumping just a fraction in defeat. "I need to get to town, to the Sage Telegraph office. Juniper Gulch is a good 2-hour walk, longer in the dark." He looked from her to the useless buckboard. Her horse, a fine-looking sorrel, stood patiently in its harness, occasionally flicking its ears at the persistent wind. "My ranch is closer. You could stay the night." "No," she said, the word sharp and immediate. "I can't. The telegraph office. It's urgent." She took a step toward him, and, for the first time, she tilted her head up slightly, allowing the fading light to catch a glimpse of her features. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes that seemed to hold a storm in their depths. She was younger than he'd thought. "I'll pay you for a ride." Holt had never been a man to take money for a simple act of decency, but something in her posture, a rigid, almost desperate self-sufficiency, told him she would argue with charity. He simply nodded. "Get what you need. I'll unhitch your horse." While he worked the leather traces, she retrieved a small, heavy-looking satchel from the buckboard. That was all. She left everything else behind, as if it meant nothing to her. When he had her sorrel unharnessed and tied to the back of the crippled wagon, he brought Balthazar around. "My name is Holt Mercer," he offered, extending a hand to help her up. She ignored the hand, placing a booted foot in the stirrup and swinging herself up behind the saddle with a fluid grace that spoke of long hours riding. She settled behind him, her satchel clutched tightly in her lap, careful not to press against him. Ivy Larkspur. The name was like her, unexpected and hinting at a world far from the grit of Juniper Gulch. As Balthazar began the steady climb out of the arroyo, she spoke again, her voice low and close to his ear, her words precise and chilling. "There's a condition, Mr. Mercer. We can't be seen together." Holt's hands tightened on the reins. He could feel the warmth of her breath, a stark contrast to the cold weight of her words. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the brim of her hat from the corner of his eye. "Ma'am, when we get to town, you are to drop me at the edge, by the livery. I'll walk the rest of the way. No one can know I rode with you. No one can see us arrive as a pair." Holt fell silent, processing the request. Juniper Gulch wasn't a city. It was a handful of wooden buildings clinging to the edge of nowhere, a place where the arrival of a stranger was a week's worth of news. Secrecy was a commodity more valuable and more difficult to keep than gold. In this town, "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Even a man's shadow has ears. People will see what they want to see. Then we must not give them anything to look at," she countered, her tone leaving no room for debate. He didn't argue further. A request that strange was born of a trouble far deeper than a broken wheel, and he knew better than to ask questions that weren't his to answer. As the first lights of the town appeared, small and yellow in the vast twilight, the wind picked up, carrying a chill that promised a cold night. Without a word, Holt unbuttoned his heavy duster, shrugging one side of it off his shoulder and draping it over her. It was a clumsy, awkward gesture, but it shielded her slight frame from the wind and further obscured her from any curious eyes. She stiffened for a moment at the contact, then seemed to accept the silent, practical offering, pulling the worn canvas around herself. He did as she asked, stopping Balthazar in the deep shadows of the livery stable. The air was thick with the smell of hay and manure. She slid from the horse's back before he could offer help, landing silently on the dusty ground. She adjusted the heavy coat around her, pulling her hat down even further. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." She pressed a few coins into his hand. He closed his fingers over them, the metal cold against his skin. He watched as she moved away, a small, determined shadow swallowed by the larger shadows of the alleyways. She didn't head for the main street but cut behind the blacksmiths, taking the long way around. Holt stayed put, a statue of man and horse, until she was gone from sight. Only then did he dismount, leading Balthazar to the water trough. From the saloon across the street, a piano played a tinny, cheerful tune that felt entirely out of place. Men's laughter spilled out into the night, but Holt's attention was fixed on the single-lit window of the Sage telegraph office at the far end of the street. He waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, a figure emerged from the alley beside the general store and slipped quickly up the steps to the office porch. Ivy, even from this distance, he could see the furtive way she checked the street before entering. The door closed behind her, leaving Holt alone with the town's disquieting quiet. He knew he should head home. The chores wouldn't do themselves, and the foreclosure notice tacked to the door of the Pike Anders Bank was a constant, nagging reminder that every moment counted. But he didn't move. Inside the telegraph office, the clerk, a reedy man named Elias Thorne, whose primary occupation was the collection and dissemination of gossip, watched Ivy with undisguised curiosity. She paid for the telegram in cash, writing out the message and the recipient's information with a swift, steady hand. Elias's eyes flickered over the paper as she wrote. The message was brief, addressed to a Mr. Alistair Finch, legal guardian in Cheyenne. The signature at the bottom was a simple, anonymous Jane Smith. The whole transaction took less than 5 minutes. When Ivy left, she didn't look back. She didn't return the way she came, but continued down the street. Melting into the darkness at the opposite end of town, Holt finally turned to leave, his mind a tangle of unanswered questions. As he passed the saloon, he caught fragments of a conversation drifting through the swinging doors. That sorrel tied up by the old trail, been there since midday, watched. "Brand's clean, but look at the reins. See that little dab of green paint on the buckle? That's Rail Range Syndicate tack. Saw it on the survey crew's horses last month." Holt's blood ran cold. The Syndicate. They were a shadow stretching from the Eastern Railroad lines, a conglomerate that bought up land, water rights, and politicians with equal rapacity. Their interest in a place as small as Juniper Gulch meant they smelled profit, and their profit usually meant ruin for men like him. He mounted Balthazar and nudged him into a slow walk, heading out of town not by the main road, but by a parallel cattle trail. He hadn't gone 100 yards when he saw her. Ivy was ahead of him, walking along the same trail, a solitary figure against the rising moon. She was clearly avoiding the open road, choosing the more difficult, less visible path. He didn't call out. He didn't hurry to catch up, honoring the strange pact they'd made. He simply slowed Balthazar's pace to match hers, keeping a deliberate, respectful distance of a full horse's length between them. He was her silent, unseen escort. As they passed the edge of town, his gaze was drawn, as it always was, to the large window of the Pike Anders Bank. Taped to the inside of the glass was the notice. He knew the words by heart, a litany of his failures. Notice of public auction. In accordance with the terms of the mortgage held, the property known as the Coyote Ladder Ranch will be sold to the highest bidder. The date was less than a month away. It was a death sentence written in neat, bureaucratic script. The wind shifted, carrying the clean scent of pine from the high country and the damp, earthy promise of a storm that might never arrive. From far to the east, a train whistle cut through the night, a long, lonesome cry that seemed to set the rhythm for the anxious beat of his own heart. He looked at the small, determined figure walking ahead of him, her shoulders squared against the world. I'd grown accustomed to a silence so complete it felt brittle, ready to shatter. Then she appeared, a question I didn't even know how to form. As if sensing his gaze, she stopped, turning to face him. The moonlight silvered the brim of her hat, but her face remained a mystery. She had let his duster fall from her shoulders and held it folded in her arms. "You're following me, Mr. Mercer." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "This trail leads toward my land," he answered, his own voice sounding hollow in the vast emptiness. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. She was silent for a long moment, the space between them humming with unspoken tension. She took a step closer, close enough that he could see the faint glimmer of her eyes in the darkness. She held out his duster. "Thank you for the ride, and for this." He leaned down from the saddle to take it, their fingers brushing for a fleeting instant. Her skin was cold. "Your business in Cheyenne is your own," he said, surprising himself with the words. "But the syndicate, they aren't known for idle curiosity." A flicker of something fear, or maybe just anger, crossed her features before being suppressed. She pulled her own cloak tighter around her, a shield against the cold and his observation. "If you want to keep your land, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying with the clarity of a bell. "Don't let anyone see us in the same frame. With that," she turned and walked away, her footsteps making barely a sound on the dusty trail, leaving Holt Mercer alone under the vast, indifferent sky, with the weight of her warning settling over him like the coming night. Holt Mercer didn't return to his ranch until the moon was high and indifferent. The ride from town was saturated with the encounter, the woman's strange warning echoing with every hoofbeat. His ranch house was less a home than a shelter, a collection of squared logs his father had raised, now standing against the elements out of sheer stubbornness. It was the same stubbornness that kept Holt there. He entered the cold, dark main room, the smell of wood smoke and old leather greeting him like a shroud. He didn't bother with a lamp. He knew this house by feel, by the geography of loss. His father, a man of quiet hope and calloused hands, had built this place for a family, only to be taken by a fever that burned through the county in a single summer, leaving a wake of fresh graves and hollowed-out homes. Holt had been 14. His mother, a woman who had never been suited for the high desert's unforgiving nature, had lasted one more winter, one morning. Holt woke to the sound of wagon wheels. She was leaving with a train of prospectors heading west, her eyes fixed on a horizon that didn't include him. She hadn't cried. She'd just said, "There's nothing left to bury here." Holt, not even me. He was raised by what remained the bawling of calves, the sting of dust in a dry year, and the ever-present, deepening shadow of the ledger book at Pike Anders Bank. The debt his father took on to buy the seed herd had become Holt's inheritance, a chain he dragged through every season. Now, that chain was tightening. He walked to the window, looking out over the moonlit pasture, or what should have been pasture. The grass was brittle, the earth pale and cracked. His cattle, silhouettes against the skyline, were thin. They were skeletons draped in hide, their ribs a testament to his failure. And it was a failure he couldn't understand. The creek, the one that gave Bitter Creek Arroyo its name and his ranch its lifeblood, had slowed to a trickle 2 months ago, and now it was just a scar of dry stones. It was as if the mountain itself had decided to hold its breath. He knew what the town was whispering. He'd heard it from Old Man Hemlock at the general store. Lydia Pike, the banker's daughter, had her eye on his land. Lydia, with her Eastern schooling and her calculating gaze, saw the Coyote Ladder not as a home, but as a strategic parcel. The rumor was she'd offered to forgive the debt entirely if he'd just signed the deed over. She wanted the land, but more than that, she wanted the water rights attached to it even if that water had vanished. Holt would rather set a match to the barn than hand her the keys. But pride didn't pay the note. The foreclosure auction was a cloud blotting out the sun, and he was standing in its shadow, miles away, in a small, clean room above the Juniper Gulch Bakery. Ivy Larkspur lit a single lamp. She had paid for the room for a week, in cash, using the name Jane Smith. The room was sparse, an iron bedstead, a wash basin, and a small table. It was all she needed. She locked the door, a flimsy defense at best, and finally unclasped the heavy satchel. She hadn't lied to Holt, not about her name. At least, she was Ivy Larkspur, and until 3 months ago, she had been the most meticulous records clerk in the Cheyenne Land Office. She had loved the work. She loved the clean lines of the maps, the precise language of the deeds, the way the entire, sprawling territory was being written into existence, one parcel at a time. Her job was to file the homestead claims, the mineral rights, the water dockets, and that's where she'd found them. The blank spaces. They were subtle, tiny discrepancies on the survey maps. A creek that was marked as seasonal, when she knew from older charts it was perennial. A spring that was mysteriously absent from a new filing, only to appear on a neighboring parcel filed a week later by a holding company. These weren't mistakes. They were thefts, committed with ink and paper before a single shovel ever broke ground. They were stealing the water. Her memory, sharp and unwelcome, threw her back into the dusty sunlight of the Cheyenne office. It was a Tuesday. She'd been reviewing the docket for the Ash Mesa watershed, the very same watershed that fed Juniper Gulch. A new filing by the Rail Range Syndicate requested a diversion for agricultural testing. The signature authorizing the survey was supposedly from the district commissioner, but Ivy knew his signature. She'd filed it 100 times. This one was close, but the loop on the G was too tight, the pressure on the downstroke too even. It was a forgery. She did what she thought was right. She brought the file to her supervisor. The next day, 2 men were waiting for her. One was a U.S. Marshal. The other was a man she'd never seen, dressed in a fine suit that looked out of place in the dusty office. He introduced himself as Amos Drager, an agent for the syndicate. He smiled, a thin, reptilian gesture that didn't touch his cold eyes. He informed her that an audit had found irregularities in her own ledgers. A sum of money, $200, was missing from the filing fees. They'd found it in a tin box in a rented room. It was a plant, a crude and horrifyingly effective one. She was framed. Drager had been polite, almost paternal. He'd explained that the syndicate was prepared to overlook the matter. The U. Marshal, clearly on their payroll, had looked bored. There would be no trial. Drager had explained. No messy public record. She would simply resign, effective immediately, and leave Cheyenne. If she ever spoke of the Ash Mesa docket, or the forgery, or the syndicate, the embezzlement charges would be refiled, and this time, they would be prosecuted. A woman like you, he'd said, his voice soft, would not last long in a federal penitentiary. She was ruined, shamed, terrified, and silenced. She packed her bags that night, but in her haste and her fury, she'd taken 2 things: She'd slipped a copy of the county brand book, a record of every rancher's legal mark, into her satchel. And in the office, in a moment of pure, blind instinct, she had torn the forged Ash Mesa docket in half. She'd grabbed the bottom portion, the one with the false signature, and left the top, descriptive half on the desk. It was a useless, panicked act, a fragment, half the evidence. Now, in this small room, she spread her meager arsenal on the bed, the copy of the brand book, the torn, official paper with its forged signature, and her own hand-drawn maps, composites of the blank spaces she had memorized. She hadn't come back to Juniper Gulch to hide. She'd come back to fight. Amos Drager and the syndicate had stolen her name, her job, and her future. In return, she was going to expose their entire scheme. She was going to give the water back to the people they were robbing blind. And that's where the two worlds collided. Her finger traced a line on her map, following the path of the supposedly seasonal creek, the syndicate's illegal diversion. The one she was certain they were building based on the forged docket would have to start somewhere. There was a natural channel, a deep cut through the rock shelf at the northern edge of the valley. It was the only logical place to build a hidden dam and pipeline. She cross-referenced her map with the county plat, the access point, the single piece of land that controlled the choke point for the entire watershed, belonged to Coyote Ladder Ranch. The owner, Holt Mercer. She needed access to that land. She needed to find the diversion, to document it, and she needed someone who knew the terrain better than she did, someone who could move through it without raising suspicion. She needed the man she had warned away just hours before. Holt spent the next day riding his northern fence line, his gut coiled in a knot of dread. The silence of the land felt different now. It felt watchful. Ivy Larkspur's warning had put a name to the faceless anxiety that had been hounding him. The syndicate. It made a terrible kind of sense. A simple drought didn't kill a creek this fast. This was an execution. He was checking the fence near the mouth of the dried-up creek when he found it. Tucked behind a stand of juniper, almost invisible, was a surveyor's stake. It wasn't one of his. It was new, the pine still smelling faintly of resin. Near it, half covered by a rock, was a clear hoofprint, but not from a shod ranch horse. It was the print of a mule, the kind used by survey crews to haul heavy equipment. He stared at the stake, the pieces clicking into place with the sickening finality of a jail cell door locking. They weren't just planning to take his land at auction. They were already on it. They were already stealing the water. He was so lost in his anger that he didn't hear her approach. "Mr. Mercer." He spun, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of the axe on his saddle. Ivy Larkspur stood 20 feet away, her own horse nowhere in sight. She must have walked the last mile, her steps silenced by the soft earth. "I told you," he said, his voice a low growl, "to stay away, and I told you that you would lose your land if you were seen with me," she replied, her voice calm and even. "But I don't think you understand. Mr. Mercer, you're losing it anyway." She gestured to the stake he had just found. "You're not in a drought. You're the victim of a robbery." He dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "What do you know about this?" "I know that the Rail Range Syndicate filed a forged water docket in Cheyenne to divert the entirety of the Ash Mesa Creek. I know their agent. Amos Drager is the one pulling the strings. And I know the head of their illegal pipeline starts somewhere on this northern ridge of your property." Holt's world tilted. This woman, this stranger, had just given a voice to his deepest, darkest fear. "Who are you?" he asked, the words raw. "I'm the woman who tried to stop them," Ivy said, her face hardening with the memory. "And I'm the one they framed for embezzlement to silence me." She took a step closer, into the fragile light that filtered through the trees. "They took my name. Mr. Mercer, they are taking your water. They're choking this entire valley, and they're using Lydia Pike and your father's debt to make sure you can't fight back when they auction off your land." He looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time, he saw the exhaustion under her eyes, the fierce, burning intelligence in them, and the profound, crushing weight of a woman who had nothing left to lose. He was a man who had been defined by his silence. She was a woman who had been silenced. I need to find that diversion, Mr. Mercer. I need to document it, to get proof that will stand up in court, she said. But I don't know this terrain. I don't know the shadows. You do. I have the maps, the knowledge of their crime. You have the battlefield. Holt looked from her face to the dry, dead creek bed. He thought of his father's hands building the house, of his mother's back as she walked away, of the cattle's low, hungry bawling. He was being squeezed from all sides. The bank in front, the syndicate behind. This woman was offering him not hope, but a weapon, a dangerous one. You said we can't be seen together, he stated. And we can't, she affirmed. If Drager, or his local foreman, a man named Tolliver, sees us, they'll know I've told you. They'll bury the evidence, and they'll bury me, and they'll accelerate your foreclosure. We have to do this without anyone knowing. No one, ever. He was a solitary man. He'd spent his life trusting no one but himself, and even that was a shaky proposition lately. Now he was being asked to trust a stranger with the one thing he had left. What's in it for you? He asked. Vengeance. Justice, she corrected him, her voice quiet but absolute. I want my name back. You want your water back. The motives are different, but the path is the same. He stood there for a long time, the only sound the wind sighing through the pines. He was a man cornered. He could either lie down and let the bank and the syndicate take everything, or he could take the hand of this ghost, this woman with a forged past and a desperate future. He finally gave a single, curt nod. Where do we start? A small, almost imperceptible breath of relief escaped her. They'll be working, but only when they think no one is watching. At night, we need to find the main access point. You'll have to lead me. We can only move after dark. And if we're caught, then I'm just a drifter trespassing, and you're just a rancher running me off, she said. The alliance is invisible, or it's fatal. Holt looked up at the ridge, the sun beginning to dip behind it, casting long, encroaching shadows across the valley. So we walked together, he said, tasting the irony. Ivy met his gaze, her own unflinching. We walked together, she agreed. In the dark, the night air was cold, but the tension was a separate, prickling heat on Holt's skin. He and Ivy stood in the deep shadow of the arroyo, a mile from town. The sliver of moon offered just enough light to see the determined set of her jaw. Tonight, she said, her voice low and stripped of all emotion but purpose. I have to get into the records archive at the town hall. It's the only place the original county plats are stored. I need the true map of the Ash Mesa watershed. Holt's instincts, honed by a lifetime of solitary survival, screamed against the idea. The town hall. That's not a barn. Ivy, it's locked, and the sheriff's office is right next door. I know. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the distant, faint lights of Juniper Gulch. I don't need you to break the door. I need you to be my eyes. I need you to watch. If anyone comes, I need to know. He took a step closer, frustrated by the wall of secrecy she kept between them. You're asking me to stand lookout while you burgle the county archives, and I still don't know the whole truth. You said we can't be seen. You said it was dangerous, but you never said why. Why is it so important? What happens if they see us? Ivy finally turned to face him. Her eyes, pools of shadow in the faint light, held a deep, weary anger. Because they aren't just watching for me. Amos Drager, the syndicate man who framed me. He keeps tabs on everyone who ever worked at the Cheyenne land office. He has descriptions, names, last known whereabouts. He has a network of informants in every town the syndicate has an interest in. He's waiting for one of us to show up. She let the silence hang, letting the weight of her words settle on him. If one of his men sees me, she continued, they'll report it. If they see me talking to a local, especially a local rancher whose land they're actively trying to steal, Drager will know I'm not just passing through. He'll know I'm here to expose him. He will connect me to you. And that foreclosure notice on your land, they'll find a way to make it immediate. The bank will seize your ranch before the sun rises. They won't wait for the auction. You will be ruined. And I will be silenced. Permanently. That's what happens. Holt felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the night air. She was right. He was already a fly in the web. She was just the spider that had wandered in and shown him the strands. "All right," he said, his voice a low growl. "How do we do this? I'll go in the back. There's a window in the archives office that never latched right. I used to open it for air. I'm betting no one's fixed it." She pulled a small, dark bundle from her satchel. "You ride into town, but not directly. Circle wide. Make sure you're not followed. Stay in the shadows by the cattle pens. You can see the front and back of the town hall from there. And if trouble comes, you ride. Holt, you ride hard. And you don't look back. You don't try to help me. You don't even look in my direction. The proof is the only thing that matters. If I'm caught, you're the only one left who knows the truth." "I'm not in the habit of running," he said, his jaw tightening. "Then get in the habit. For tonight." "We need a signal," she thought for a moment. "The fence by the pens. If you see someone coming, tap the top rail. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Like a woodpecker. Anything else? Any other sound. And I'm not coming out? 3. Pause. 2, he repeated, the rhythm settling in his mind. "Go. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She nodded once, a quick, sharp gesture. And then she was gone, melting into the shadows of the creek bed, a ghost heading toward the lights. Holt mounted Balthazar, his mind racing. He didn't ride straight in. He took the long cattle trail, the one that skirted the ridge, letting his eyes adjust, watching the movements of the town below. He saw the usual late-night traffic at the Copperfinch Saloon. He saw the light on in the bank Lydia Pike, working late, as usual. As he neared the edge of town, a flicker of movement by the saloon's horse trough caught his eye. A man was standing there. Not drinking, not smoking, just watching. The man stepped out of the shadow for a moment to spit tobacco, and Holt's stomach clenched. Wade Tolliver, the syndicate's local foreman. A man known for his quick temper and his even quicker loyalty to the railroad's money. Tolliver's gaze swept the street, and for a moment, it landed on Holt, a dark shape on the trail. Holt kept Balthazar at a slow, steady walk, as if he were just a rancher coming in for a late drink. Tolliver didn't wave. He didn't nod. He just watched. Then, with a deliberate slowness, Tolliver pulled a small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil stub from his vest pocket. He licked the pencil and wrote something down. His eyes still fixed on Holt. He was being logged. The thought sent a jolt of cold adrenaline through him. Ivy was right. They were watching. Holt forced himself to continue, dismounting at the livery, tying Balthazar with feigned casualness. He gave the horse a long, slow rub-down, his movements belying the frantic pounding in his chest. Tolliver had finally turned and gone back into the saloon. Holt waited. He waited until the street was empty, and then, staying deep in the alleys, he made his way to the cattle pens. From his vantage point, he could see it all: the bright, noisy saloon, the quiet bank, the dark monolith of the town hall, and the shadowed alley that ran behind it. He leaned against the fence, a man invisible, his hand resting on the top rail. Ivy moved like smoke. She'd slipped through the alley unseen and was at the archive window. Holt held his breath. He heard the faint, dry squeal of wood on wood. She was inside. The archive room was cold and smelled of dust, dry ink, and time. Moonlight cut a single, sharp rectangle across the floor, illuminating rows of tall wooden shelves groaning with ledgers and rolled plats. Ivy knew exactly where to look. She moved to the county surveyor's cabinet, her fingers tracing the faded labels. 1870 to 1880. Ash Mesa Survey. She pulled out a long, heavy scroll. This was it, the original. She unrolled it carefully on the clerk's desk, the old parchment crackling in the silence. She took the small, powerful magnifying glass from her pocket. The map was detailed, drawn with a precise, confident hand. She found the surveyor's signature and, next to it, the official red wax seal of the territory. It was intact. It was legitimate. Then she traced the lines of the watershed, her blood turning to ice. It was exactly as she'd feared, only worse. The lines were not just slightly off. They were inverted. The map she had seen in Cheyenne, the forged syndicate map, had taken this entire quadrant and reversed it. The true, original map showed the main subterranean spring, the aquifer that fed the entire valley, originating directly under the high pasture of the Coyote Ladder Ranch. It flowed from Holt's land, feeding the creek. The forged map, the one the syndicate was using to justify their diversion, showed the water flowing toward his land from a source on the parcel they had acquired. They weren't just stealing his water. They were using a fraudulent map to claim his water had been theirs all along. This single document proved it. It was premeditated, high-level fraud. A sound from the street made her freeze. A man's laugh, loud and rough. It was coming from the front of the town hall. Holt saw it, too. Wade Tolliver and another man had come out of the saloon. They weren't heading home. They were walking slowly toward the town hall, peering into the shadows. Tolliver's hand was on the butt of his pistol. They were suspicious. Holt's mind raced. 3, pause, 2. But if he tapped, she'd be trapped inside. He needed to pull them away. He needed noise. He needed chaos. His eyes scanned the area. The night market was packing up. A few vendors still had wagons near the livery. And beside him, the cattle pen held 3 large steers, dozing on their feet. The rope latch was a simple loop. Holt moved. He crept to the gate, untied the rope, and left it hanging loose. He ran back to the alley, vaulted onto a stack of hay bales, and let out a piercing, animal yell that echoed off the buildings. In the same motion, he pulled his own horsewhip from his belt and cracked it hard against the wooden wall of the livery. It sounded exactly like a rifle shot. "Yeah, get 'em!" he roared into the night. The effect was instantaneous. The 3 steers, startled from their sleep by the yell and the crack, shoved against the unlatched gate. It flew open. They burst out onto the main street, eyes wide with panic, bellowing in confusion. "Stampede!" a vendor screamed. Tolliver and his man spun around. "What in the hell?" Tolliver grabbed his hat as the steers thundered past, straight toward the remnants of the market. Carts overturned. Men shouted. It was a perfect, contained burst of chaos. Both men, their instincts as cattlemen overriding their suspicion, sprinted down the street to help contain the animals. In the archive, Ivy heard the shot and the shouting. That was not the signal. It was something else. A diversion? Holt. She didn't hesitate. She rolled the precious map, slipped it into the thin leather scroll case she'd carried in, and ran for the window. She was out and on the ground in seconds. The diversion had pulled Tolliver and his man completely away from the town hall. The alley was clear. Across the street, in the bank, Lydia Pike looked up from her ledger, her face tight with annoyance. The noise from the street was intolerable. She had heard the crack and the yelling. She went to the window, peering out. The steers were being rounded up near the general store, but her eyes were drawn to the darker patches of the street. A shadow detached itself from the alley beside the town hall. It was a person, moving fast, too slight to be a man, a woman. Lydia watched, her eyes narrowing, as the figure darted across the street and paused in the deep shadow of the church. The woman stooped, seemed to tamper with something at the base of the wall, and then was gone, vanishing into the alley that led toward the arroyo. Lydia's hand went to the lace at her throat. Who is that woman? She'd never seen her before. And what was she doing? Hiding things by the church in the middle of the night? A prickle of jealousy, sharp and acidic, rose in her. She had heard Holt Mercer was in town. Was this his secret? Was this the woman the gossips were whispering about? The suspicion settled over her like a cold fog. Ivy didn't stop running until she reached the cottonwood grove, her lungs burning. Holt was already there, Balthazar breathing hard. "Did you get it?" he demanded, his voice rough with tension. "I got it," she gasped, holding up the leather case as if it were a holy relic. The original Ash Mesa map. It's worse than I thought. Holt, they inverted the survey. They flipped the whole quadrant. The map proves the water originates on your land. It's federal fraud. He felt a dark, savage satisfaction. It wasn't hope, but it was a start. Is it enough? Can we take this to the sheriff? Ivy shook her head, the elation already fading from her face. No, not yet. A map can be challenged. They'll say the original 1870 surveyor was wrong and that theirs is a correction. They'll bury us in legal motions until your land is gone. The map proves what they did. It doesn't prove why. What do you mean? We need to prove intent, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. We need to prove they knew they were stealing your water. We need to connect the fraudulent map to the man who benefits. We need to tie the syndicate to the land. And how do we do that? Holt asked. Ivy looked up at him, her face a pale oval in the darkness. There's only one way. We need the second piece, the one document that connects the land to the men who claim it. We need the official 1886 County Brand Book. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets. He was in deeper than he could ever have imagined. This wasn't a property dispute. This was a war, fought with maps and ledgers instead of bullets. They'll guard that book, he said, thinking of the clerk, Elias Thorne, and the locked safe in the sheriff's office. I know, Ivy said. She stepped closer, putting a hand on his forearm. Her touch was light, but it seared through the thick canvas of his shirt. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily. Holt, she said, her voice just for him. We have to do this, but the stakes just got higher. From this moment until the water is back in your creek, no one can ever know. No one can know you helped me tonight. No one can know I'm helping you. We are ghosts to each other. In town, in the light. We are strangers. It's the only way. He looked down at her hand, small and capable, resting on his arm. Then he met her gaze. He saw the iron in her, the will that matched his own. Ghosts, he agreed. The word was a vow. Strangers. Their alliance was forged in shadow, but their work had to be done in the punishing light of day. They met in the high pastures, far from any trail, becoming two ghosts haunting the fringes of the Coyote Ladder Ranch. In these stolen hours, a strange and silent apprenticeship began. Holt, a man who could read the earth like a book, began to teach her its language. You're looking for tracks, he said one blistering afternoon, his voice low as he knelt by a patch of sparse bunch grass. But you're looking for a boot print. You need to look smaller. He pointed. See the grass? How it's bent east, that's not wind. Wind is random. This is a line. Something passed here, moving fast. He taught her to read the subtle signs of passage. He showed her the faint, white crust of alkali on the stones, a sign that a horse had sweated heavily, its perspiration drying to salt. He showed her how a displaced pebble, its damp side turned up to the sun, was a clock that could tell you, within an hour, when someone had passed. Ivy, in turn, opened her satchel on the flat rock they used as a table. The ink-stained maps spread beside Holt's dusty saddle. You're looking at the land, she explained, her finger tracing a contour line. But you're not seeing the text. This isn't just a map. Holt, it's a contract. Every line here is a promise, or a lie. She taught him to see the legal architecture hidden beneath the rock and soil. This public easement, it looks harmless. But see how it's worded, access for county maintenance. Tolliver's men are the county maintenance crew. The syndicate had him appointed. That's how they move their equipment without question. It's a loophole big enough to drive a wagon through. He learned to see his own land through her eyes not as a home, but as a collection of clauses, of rights given and rights stolen. She showed him how the forged survey wasn't just a mistake, but a calculated legal dagger aimed at the heart of his water rights. He was a man of action. She was a woman of text. Out here, they were learning to be both. Their work was not just theoretical. It was hard, physical labor, soaked in sweat and alkali dust. The boundary fence is down by the north ridge. He told her, it's how they're moving their equipment in at night. We need to fix it, but we need to make it look like a simple repair. They worked for hours under a sky that was a white-hot sheet of metal. Holt dug the post holes, his muscles straining, the sweat cutting clean rivers through the grime on his face and arms. Ivy, tougher than her slender frame suggested, hauled the heavy pine posts and stretched the barbed wire, her gloved hands bleeding where the barbs tore through the leather. Then, near the downed fence line, Holt stopped. He kicked at a pile of loose stones. This is wrong. What is? Ivy asked, wiping her forearm across her brow, leaving a streak of mud. The marker. My father's corner post. He dug at the stones, pulling them away to reveal a heavy iron survey marker, half buried. This is the legal corner of my property, or it was. He squinted at the sun, then at the 2 peaks they used for triangulation. It's off. It's been moved. Ivy was instantly at his side, her fatigue forgotten. How far? Holt paced it out, his long strides precise. He stopped, drove his heel into the dried dirt, and looked back at the stake. 3 handspans, he said, his voice thick with a cold fury. Just over 2 feet. They moved it 2 feet to the west. To the west, Ivy whispered, her mind racing. She pulled out her notebook. Of course, by moving the marker, they've shifted the entire property line, the easement, the one they're using. This corrects the map. It moves the easement squarely onto their own parcel. They're not just trespassing. Holt, they've legally erased the trespass. It's brilliant. It's diabolical. Holt grabbed the heavy sledgehammer. I'm moving it back. No, she said, grabbing his arm. Wait, you move it back. They'll know we're onto them. We document this. This is the living proof. This is the detail that makes the fraud real. She sat on her horse, her saddle now her desk, and began to write. She sketched the location, the position of the sun, the landmarks. She noted the fresh dirt, the lack of vegetation around the marker, proving it had been recently disturbed. The sun was relentless. Holt watched as beads of sweat rolled from her temple onto the page, the blue ink blurring, the words of legal fact dissolving into the page like an early summer rain. She cursed softly, blotting the page with her sleeve. The frontier, it seemed, was determined to smudge the very evidence they were gathering. When she was done, Holt picked up the sledge. Now, she agreed. Together. They dug the new hole in the correct location, 3 handspans to the east. Holt lifted the heavy iron stake, its weight a physical manifestation of his claim, and with 3 powerful, ringing blows, he drove it back into the earth where it belonged. The sound was a declaration of war, lost in the vast, empty silence. That evening, as the heat finally broke and the sky turned a deep, bruised violet, Holt led her to a place he hadn't visited in months. It was a wide, shallow basin of rock that had once been the heart of his ranch. This, he said, his voice flat, is Whisper Tank. Ivy dismounted, walking to the edge. It was a graveyard, where water should have been. There was only a vast expanse of white, cracked stone. The basin was littered with the skeletons of crayfish, their pale shells like discarded porcelain. The air was dead, holding no scent of damp earth or algae, only the dry, mineral smell of dust. This was the wound. This was the seasonal creek the syndicate's map had described. She knelt, her gloved fingers tracing the deep, sun-baked fissures in the earth. The stone was still warm from the day. She had seen the fraud on paper, had traced the lies on the map. But this was the consequence. This was the life that had been stolen, the silence that had replaced the sound of water. Her eyes, fixed on the dry rock, grew dark, her entire body tensing with a contained, silent rage that was far more potent than any shout. Holt saw it. He saw the tremor in her hand, the rigid line of her back. He understood, in that moment, that this was as much her fight as it was his. He knew the feeling of hopeless fury, the need to strike out at an enemy as vast and intangible as the sky. And in a gesture of profound, unspoken respect, he turned his back, He walked a few paces away and pretended to check Balthazar's hoof, giving her the dignity of her grief, the privacy of her anger. When he turned back, she was standing, her face composed, the mask firmly back in place. "We need to check the culvert by the highway road," she said, her voice all business. "The one Tolliver's crew repaired last month." Night found them a mile away, deep in an arroyo. Their only light a single, guttering torch. The air was thick with the smell of pine resin and smoke. The culvert, a large pipe meant to channel runoff under the main wagon road, was blocked. "New wood," Holt said, holding the torch close. The barrier was made of fresh-cut, rough-sawn pine boards, nailed hastily but effectively across the culvert's mouth. "Look at the nails," Ivy said, pointing. She was counting. "They're machine-made. 9 rings on the head and the wood. Look at the saw marks. They're curved. A circular saw, not a pit saw." "Tolliver's lumber yard," Holt said, the pieces fitting together. "It's the only one in the county with a steam-powered circular saw. He got the contract to repair the county roads." "He's not repairing them," Ivy said, taking a small sample of the wood, a splinter, and wrapping it in her handkerchief. "He's weaponizing them. He's building a dam, piece by piece, right under the sheriff's nose, and getting paid with county money to do it." They were staring at the mechanics of the theft, the simple, brutal tools of the crime, shining orange in the torchlight. They rode back in silence, the weight of their discoveries settling on them. They didn't go to the ranch house, but to an old line shack, a one-room cabin on the far edge of the property, invisible from the valley. It was the only place they were truly safe. Inside, Holt built a small fire in the hearth. The shack was cramped, holding the smells of old leather, smoked wood, and dust. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the small, flickering flames painting their faces in shadow and light. The silence, which had once been Holt's only companion, was now shared. "My father," Holt said suddenly, his voice rough. "He died trying to make this land work. Fever. My mother, she left, just walked out, said the silence was too loud." He stared into the fire. "I've been here alone ever since, talking to cattle, arguing with the bank. I'm so used to the quiet. Sometimes I think I'll crack wide open if it ever stops." Ivy watched him, her usual guarded expression softening. "They didn't just fire me," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "They framed me." "Amos Drager, he had them plant money in my room. They called me a thief, in front of everyone. The people I'd worked with for years, they just watched." She picked up a small twig, feeding it to the fire. "They took my name. When you have nothing else, your name is everything. It's like they hollowed me out. Left the shell. 2 solitary wounds, sitting across a fire, quietly acknowledging each other. They were no longer just partners in a legal fight. They were 2 people who understood what it meant to be erased." A long silence settled. More comfortable this time, Holt's stomach rumbled, breaking the spell. "I brought beans," he muttered, reaching for a sack. He was a man who could survive for a week on jerky and hardtack, but his camp cooking was a disaster. He scorched the beans, the smell of burnt iron filling the small cabin. He swore, poking at the blackened mess in the pan. "It's ruined," he said, disgusted. Ivy watched him for a moment. Then a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Hand me the pan, and that tin of molasses." He watched, baffled, as she stirred a generous helping of the black-strap molasses into the burnt beans, adding a pinch of salt and a splash of water from her canteen. She scraped the pan, mixing it all together until it was a thick, bubbling, smoky stew. She handed him a tin plate. He ate it, expecting ash. Instead, it was good. The sweetness of the molasses had countered the burnt taste, turning it into something dark, rich, and oddly delicious. He looked at her in surprise, and for the first time, a sound he hadn't made in months escaped him. A short, rough laugh. She smiled back, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit her face. "My father was a terrible cook, too." The next day, They were back at the fence line, finishing the repair. The brief warmth of the night before was gone, replaced by the professional distance they needed to survive. Holt was using a hammer to secure the wire to the new post. "It needs to be tighter, on the north side," Ivy said, pointing. "I need the staple puller," he said. "Here." She reached into his saddlebag, pulling out the heavy tool. As she passed it to him, her fingers brushed his. It was nothing, a simple, accidental contact of skin on skin, but it felt like a bolt of lightning. Holt flinched, pulling his hand back as if he'd been burned. Ivy snatched her own hand away, her breath catching in her throat. They both stood frozen for a beat, the air crackling with the charge of that simple, unintended touch. The warmth of her skin seemed to be imprinted on his. He could still feel it, a vivid, tingling spot on his knuckles. They both looked away, a flush rising on Holt's neck, a dark color staining Ivy's cheeks. The danger they were in from the syndicate was suddenly joined by a different, more complicated peril. Ivy was the first to speak, her voice tight, formal. She cleared her throat. We can't be exposed. In any way, it's too dangerous." Holt stared at the fence post, his knuckles white as he gripped the hammer. He knew she wasn't just talking about Tolliver. He nodded slowly, not looking at her. He took a deep, steadying breath, the air hot and dry in his lungs. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I've never wanted to hide anyone in my life. Ivy, not until I needed to hide you." The invitation arrived via the stable boy, written on fine, cream-colored stationery that felt alien in Holt's calloused hand. It was from Lydia Pike. She requested the pleasure of his company for dinner at the hotel's private dining room to discuss a matter of mutual interest. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. He knew it, and he knew she knew it. He met Ivy that afternoon in a secluded box canyon where the acoustics made it impossible for anyone to approach unheard. He showed her the note. "It's a trap," he said, the words flat and certain. "No," Ivy countered, her eyes scanning the elegant script. "It's not a trap, it's an offer. A trap is meant to catch you. An offer is meant to make you surrender willingly." She looked up at him. "You have to go. You have to know what she's putting on the table. But Holt, say nothing about me. Say nothing about the water. You are just a rancher, worried about his loan. That's all you are." The hotel dining room was an island of eastern civility in the middle of the desert. Polished wood, clean linen, and the soft clink of real silverware. Lydia Pike sat opposite him, a portrait of cool composure in a dark silk dress. She did not look like a woman who belonged in Juniper Gulch, and she wore that fact like armor. "Thank you for coming." "Holt," she said, her smile as crisp as the napkin in her lap. "I know you're a busy man. My cattle are starving." "Lydia, I have the time," he replied, foregoing the pleasantries. Her smile didn't falter. "Precisely. That is the matter of mutual interest. The bank, as you know, holds your note, and the drought, as you know, is making it impossible for anyone to meet their obligations." "It isn't a drought," he said, his voice low. "Call it what you will," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "The effect is the same. The land is dry, the cattle are thin, the notes are coming due." She leaned forward, her eyes the color of polished river stones, locking onto his. "My father is a man of business. He sees only the numbers on a page. I, however, see the man behind the numbers. I see a legacy. I believe a compromise can be reached. Here it was, the offer. I am prepared," she continued, "to persuade the board to freeze your debt indefinitely. All payments, all interest, suspended until the rains return and your herd recovers." Holt said nothing. He watched her, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "In exchange for this consideration," Lydia said smoothly, "the bank would require a simple adjustment to the deed, a third of your northern pasture, signed over to a holding company I represent, and, of course, a clause granting that company primary rights to any and all water on the entirety of the Coyote Ladder property." There it was. Not just the land, the water. The water they had already stolen, They wanted him to sign away his right to the very thing they had taken, legitimizing their crime in exchange for his own survival. It was a checkmate. Holt slowly placed his fork down beside his untouched plate. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it filled the room. Lydia's composure finally cracked. A flicker of disbelief, then anger, crossed her face. "No, Holt, be reasonable. I am offering you a lifeline. I am offering to save your ranch. You're offering me a pen," he corrected her, "so I can sign my own death warrant. The answer is no." He stood to leave. Lydia stood as well, her face a mask of cold fury. The pretense of civility was gone, replaced by the raw, brutal edge of power. "You are a fool," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "A proud, stubborn fool. You would rather lose it all than bend an inch." She took a step closer, her voice dropping even lower, laced with a new, cruel insinuation. "Perhaps you have other assets you're relying on. I hear things. Holt, the whole town hears things. They say you're not as alone out there as you pretend to be. Tell me, are you hiding a woman at your ranch? The attack was so sudden, so personal. It took his breath away." He stared at her, his face an unreadable slab of granite. He thought of Ivy, of their vow of silence, of the danger he was in. He said nothing. His silence was all the answer she needed. He turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the lamplight, her eyes glittering with a triumphant, venomous spite. The next day, the war shifted from private rooms to the public square. Lydia's poison, planted the night before, began to sprout all over town. But it was Wade Tolliver who brought the battle to Holt's doorstep. The rumor started in the saloon and spread like a brush fire. Holt Mercer, it was said, was running a long loop. He was using a doctored branding iron, a coyote ladder brand that was subtly altered, to mark stray cattle and unbranded mavericks as his own. It was a serious crime, a betrayal of the unwritten code of the range that was more sacred than any law in the books. It was an attack on his name, his honor, his very identity as a cattleman. Holt heard it from the blacksmith, whose friendly greeting was replaced by a curt nod and a suspicious stare. He saw it in the eyes of the men at the feed store, who fell silent when he walked in. The lie was effective because it was plausible. In a time of drought, when every rancher was desperate, rustling wasn't just a crime. It was a temptation. His first instinct was a primal, burning rage. He wanted to find Tolliver. He wanted to settle this with his fists, to beat the truth out of him in the dusty main street for the whole town to see. He found Ivy at the line shack that night, pacing like a caged animal. "Tolliver is telling the whole town I'm a rustler. He's turning everyone against me." "I know," she said calmly. "I heard it at the Mercantile. It's their next move. Lydia couldn't get the land, so she's taking your reputation." "I'm going to find him," Holt growled, his hands clenching and unclenching, "and do what Ivy stepped in front of him. Her presence a small but immovable object. Beat him. Get yourself thrown in jail for assault. That's what they want, Holt. They want you to react with violence. It proves you're unstable. It makes the lie seem true. Don't fight him with your fists. Fight him with the law." "The law," he scoffed. "The sheriff is a fool, and the judge is 100 miles away." "I'm not talking about their law," she said, tapping her satchel. "I'm talking about the law of the brand." She pulled out the copy of the 1886 brand book she had taken from Cheyenne. She opened it to the C section. There, in neat, official ink, was the entry for the Coyote Ladder Ranch. It showed a perfect diagram of the brand. A simple ladder leaned against a stylized C. Below it was the date of registration and the signature of Holt's father. "This is your proof," she said. "This is a legal document. It's older than most of the deeds in this town. You don't need to shout. Holt, you just need to show them." The Copperfinch Saloon was crowded that evening, a haze of smoke and the smell of whiskey hanging in the air. Lydia Pike was there, seated at a corner table with Tolliver and 2 other men Holt recognized as syndicate surveyors. She was laughing, holding court, the queen of this dusty, desperate kingdom. Holt walked in. The room didn't fall silent, but a wave of quiet awareness rippled through it. Conversations faltered. Men turned from the bar to watch him. He ignored them all. He walked directly to Lydia's table. "Evening. Lydia, Tolliver," he said, his voice level. "Mercer." Tolliver grunted, his hand resting near his pistol. Lydia looked up at him, a smug, challenging smile on her face. "Holt, to what do we owe the pleasure? Have you come to reconsider my generous offer?" "No," Holt said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single, clean sheet of paper. It was a perfect, hand-drawn copy of the brand book page, one Ivy had spent all afternoon creating. He placed it on the table in front of her. "I heard a rumor today. A rumor about my brand. I just wanted to make sure everyone was clear on what the legally registered mark for the Coyote Ladder looks like. You can check it against the county records, if you can find them." Lydia's smile froze. She glanced down at the paper. She saw the official layout, the date, the signature. It was irrefutable. She was caught. Tolliver's lie was exposed. For a moment, she was speechless. Then, a faint, humorless smile returned to her lips. She leaned back in her chair. "My," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "How very well prepared you are. One might almost think you were expecting trouble." She picked up the paper, holding it between two delicate fingers as if it were something soiled, and let it flutter back onto the table. Holt had won the point, but he hadn't won the war. He had silenced the lie, but he had earned her undying hatred. He gave a curt nod and turned to leave. As he reached the door, it swung open. A man stepped inside, and a sudden chill seemed to cut through the warm, stuffy air of the saloon. He was dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit that was immaculate. Despite the dust of the town, his face was pale, his eyes were dark and intelligent, and a thin, polite smile rested on his lips. It was Amos Drager. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace. His eyes swept the room, missing nothing. Holt felt the man's gaze pass over him, analytical and dismissive. Then Drager's eyes found their target. Across the room, standing by the back wall, was a woman in a plain dress and a bonnet that shadowed her face. She had been observing, a ghost in the crowd. It was Ivy. Drager's polite smile widened slightly. He didn't speak to her. He didn't approach her. He simply walked past her table on his way to join Lydia. As he passed, he raised 2 fingers to the brim of his hat in a gesture of polite, almost intimate acknowledgement. He inclined his head slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft, yet carrying. He paused for a beat, just long enough for the words to land. "Cheyenne misses you." Then he was gone, seating himself at Lydia's table, his back to the room. Ivy stood frozen, her face as pale as bone. The blood had drained from her cheeks. It was a message. "I see you. I know you're here. Run!" The next day, a new kind of panic gripped Juniper Gulch. The syndicate, having failed to discredit Holt, turned its economic weapons on the entire valley. A rumor, started by Tolliver's men and amplified by the town's fear, began to circulate. A new railroad survey, they said, had found a better route. The syndicate was pulling out. They were moving their operations and the water diversion they had promised, 50 miles south to the Cinder Basin. The effect was immediate and devastating. The price of hay, already high from the manufactured drought, skyrocketed. Speculators bought up the last of the available feed. For the small ranchers, the ones with only a dozen head of cattle, it was a death knell. They couldn't afford to feed their animals through the winter. At the Mercantile, Holt watched as his neighbors, men he'd known his whole life, stood with haunted eyes, their hands turning over the few coins in their pockets. They were talking about selling their calves, selling their breeding stock, selling everything just to survive. Ivy saw it for what it was. She stood with Holt on a ridge overlooking the valley, the original stolen map clutched in her hand. "This isn't about you anymore." "Holt," she said, her voice tight with fury. "This is a full-scale assault. They're creating a panic. They're using the drought they created to bankrupt every small rancher here. When everyone is broke and desperate, they'll step back in and buy the land and the water rights for pennies on the dollar. It's a complete takeover. The pressure was becoming unbearable. That night, Holt found the first note. It was pushed under his cabin door. A single sheet of cheap paper. There was no signature. Just 2 words, crudely written, "Get out." He might have dismissed it as a prank, but for the fine, black dust that smeared the paper and came off on his fingers. Coal dust. The kind that covered everything and everyone at Tolliver's lumber yard. From the steam-powered saw, it was a signature, blacker than any ink. 2 nights later, there was another. This one was nailed to his barn door. Last warning. It was also smeared with coal dust. They were no longer hiding. They were threatening him directly, daring him to react. He and Ivy met in the line shack, the 2 notes lying on the table between them like dead things. The walls felt like they were closing in. "They're trying to scare you into running," Ivy said, "or into making a mistake." "I'm not running," Holt said, his voice a low growl. "But I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of defending. It's time we fought back." Ivy looked at the notes, then at the map, then at Holt's grim, determined face. He was right. Hiding and reacting wasn't enough. They had the proof, but they had no way to use it safely. They needed to force the syndicate's hand. They needed to draw the snake out of its hole. A plan began to form in her mind. A dangerous, desperate gamble. She took a deep breath. "All right," she said. "We set a trap." She looked at him, her eyes shining with a feverish, intelligent light. "Tolliver thinks the only proof we have is your brand registration. He doesn't know about the map. Let's use what he thinks we have against him." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm going to let a rumor of my own slip out. I'll tell the baker's wife that I'm meeting a man tomorrow night, a man who's interested in buying some old family papers. I'll let her overhear me say that I'm bringing the original. Signed 1886 brand book to the old abandoned warehouse by the creek, to prove the value of the papers." "They'll kill you," Holt said instantly. "No," she countered. "They won't kill me. They'll try to steal the book. That book is the only thing discrediting their rustling rumors. They want it. They'll send Tolliver. And when he shows up to rob me." She looked at Holt, a flicker of a grim smile on her lips. "You'll be waiting." The sky had been a liar all day, promising relief with high, wispy clouds that offered no shade. Now, as Holt and Ivy checked the newly repaired fence line, the lie soured, the air grew heavy, still, and an unnatural, bruised yellow light bled across the horizon. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath, died completely. In the sudden, ringing silence, the world seemed to be holding its breath. "Storm's coming," Holt said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at the sky, but at his horse, Balthazar, whose ears were twitching nervously. His nostrils flared, a bad one. Ivy looked west. The horizon was no longer a line. It was a wall, a solid mass of churning, dark blue cloud that was advancing with an unnerving speed. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice tight. "Not long enough to get back to the ranch house," he answered, already swinging into his saddle. "The line shack. It's our only chance. We have to ride now." There was no time to argue. The first gust of wind hit them like a physical blow, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. It was a cold wind, a shock against their sweat-soaked skin. They spurred their horses, racing across the high pasture as the world dissolved behind them. The sky opened up with a roar, the rain not falling but being driven horizontally, each drop a tiny, stinging pellet. It was like riding through thrown gravel. The line shack was a dark smudge against the gray landscape, a half-rotten testament to Holt's grandfather's optimism. They reached it just as the first crack of lightning split the sky, followed a heartbeat later by a clap of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Holt threw himself from the saddle, wrestling with the swollen wooden door, while Ivy fought to control the terrified horses. He finally kicked the door open and grabbed the reins from her, pulling the animals into the relative safety of the attached lean-to. They stumbled into the single-bed, dark room, gasping for breath. the wind howling at the door as Holt slammed it shut and threw the heavy bar. The sudden quiet inside was deafening, broken only by the frantic drumming of rain on the tin roof and their own ragged breathing. Ivy was soaked to the bone. Her hair was plastered to her face and neck, and water dripped from the hem of her simple dress, pooling on the dusty floorboards. She was shivering violently, her lips already tinged with blue, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to find warmth. Holt didn't hesitate. He moved with the grim efficiency of a man who had fought this land his entire life. He struck a match, the small flare of light pushing back the oppressive darkness, and lit the wick of an old kerosene lamp. Then he turned to the hearth, stuffing it with dry kindling he kept in a tin box. Within minutes, a small, hungry fire was crackling, its warmth a fragile but welcome promise. "Get out of those wet things," he said, his back to her. He pulled a rough, clean wool blanket from a storage chest. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on stringing a length of rope between two wall pegs, creating a makeshift clothesline near the fire. He was giving her the courtesy of his back, a shield of privacy in the tiny, enclosed space. Ivy stood frozen for a moment, the cold in her bones warring with the sudden, intimate awkwardness of the situation. She was trapped, vulnerable, and alone with this silent, solitary man. The rules they had so carefully constructed had been washed away by the storm. We can't be seen together," she whispered, the words a familiar refrain, but they sounded weak now, a flimsy defense against the reality of their confinement. She was staring out the single grimy window, watching the rain lash against the glass, blurring the world outside into a formless gray chaos. Holt was unbuttoning his own soaked duster, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't turn around. His voice, when he spoke, was a low murmur, almost lost in the sound of the storm. "Out here," he said softly, "there's only the wind to see." His words hung in the air, a quiet absolution. He was right. The world of Juniper Gulch, of Lydia Pike and Amos Drager, was gone. Out here, in this storm-lashed sanctuary, they were just a man and a woman, seeking shelter. She finally moved, her numb fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress. She stripped off the sodden layers, wrapping the thick, scratchy wool blanket around her shivering body. Holt, without looking, hung his heavy duster on the rope, then took her wet clothes from her outstretched hand, his fingers brushing hers for a brief, electric moment before he hung them beside his own. They steamed in the heat of the fire, small ghosts rising in the lamplight. He gestured to the hearth. "Get close, get warm." She huddled on the floor, pulling the blanket tight, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Holt sat a few feet away, close enough to share the warmth but far enough to respect the distance between them. The fire popped and hissed. The rain beat a relentless tattoo on the roof. They sat in a silence that was no longer empty or tense, but filled with the roar of the storm and the shared, unspoken reality of their situation. Slowly, the violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The warmth of the fire was a balm, loosening the knot of fear and cold that had been clenched in her chest. She looked at Holt. He was staring into the flames, his profile carved by the flickering light, his face a landscape of hard lines and quiet sorrows. The firelight softened the severity of his expression, revealing a weariness that matched her own. He must have felt her gaze, because he turned his head and looked at her. In his eyes, she didn't see a stranger or a co-conspirator. She saw a man who understood solitude, who knew the weight of a stolen legacy. He saw a woman whose fierce intellectual armor had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, bruised core of who she was. He shifted, moving closer, and pulled one end of the heavy blanket from the floor, draping it over his own shoulders. Now they were sharing it, a single shield against the cold, a small, shared world in the heart of the storm. The space between them shrank until their shoulders were almost touching. The air grew thick with unspoken things. The roar of the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. It was Ivy who moved first, a small, almost imperceptible shift, her head tilting slightly toward his. It was a question asked without words. Holt's response was just as quiet. He leaned in, his own movement hesitant, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, tasting of rain and cold and the faint, smoky scent of the fire. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of the silent, lonely battles they had both been fighting. When he pulled back, her eyes were open, searching his. He saw no fear, no regret. He saw only a reflection of his own profound loneliness, a mirror of his own unspoken need. He raised a hand, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray strand of damp hair from her cheek. The gesture was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the harshness of his life, of his hands. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. This time, when he kissed her, it was different. It was a surrender. The careful walls they had built around themselves, the roles they had been forced to play, crumbled into dust. The kiss deepened, becoming a slow, deliberate exploration, a silent conversation in the firelight. His hand moved from her cheek to the nape of her neck, his thumb stroking her skin. Her hand, which had been clutching the blanket, came up to rest on his chest, her fingers curling into the rough fabric of his shirt. Their breathing quickened, then steadied, finding a shared rhythm. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, her head resting on his shoulder, the blanket a warm cocoon around them both, in the small, sheltered space of the cabin, with the storm raging outside. They found a moment of quiet, desperate peace. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice a rough sound against her hair. "I know," she whispered back. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the wall. The lamplight softened, the kerosene burning low. In the reflection of their eyes, the small flame of the hearth burned brightly, then slowly faded to black. The world returned with the pale, washed-clean light of morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that smelled of wet earth and pine. Inside the cabin, a chill had settled. The fire was nothing but a bed of gray, glowing embers. Holt was awake first. He moved slowly, carefully, untangling himself from the blanket and from Ivy, who was still asleep, her face peaceful in a way he had never seen. He added wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life. When she woke, the spell was broken. The intimacy of the night was a ghost, and the cold, hard reality of their situation returned. They dressed in their now dry clothes in a stiff, awkward silence. The easy closeness of the firelight was gone, replaced by a chasm of unspoken words. They were strangers again. The roles they had shed in the storm now pulled back on like uncomfortable but necessary armor. He handed her a cup of hot, black coffee. She took it, their fingers carefully avoiding contact. They stood by the door, ready to face the world. "Ivy," he started, his voice rough. "Don't," she said softly, not looking at him. "We can't." He understood. What had happened in the cabin had to stay there, a secret within a secret, too dangerous to acknowledge. He gave a single, curt nod. She nodded back. It was all the communication they could afford. He opened the door. The air was crisp and cool. The ground was soft, a blank slate of mud. Or it should have been. Holt froze. There, not 20 feet from the cabin door, were hoof prints. They were not from his horse or hers. They were from a large, heavy-shod gelding. And beside them, in the mud, was the clear, distinct imprint of a man's boot. The tracks led from the direction of the woods, circled the cabin, and then went back the way they came. "Tolliver," Holt breathed, his voice a knife's edge. "He was here." Ivy knelt, her face grim. She pointed to a small, disturbed patch of ground near the cabin's foundation. "Look!" It was the spot where Holt had thrown out the ashes from the hearth that morning. A small pile of gray dust and blackened wood chunks. The boot print was right beside it. "The ashes are fresh," Ivy said, her voice a low, chilling whisper. He knows someone was here last night." The sanctuary had been violated, the brief peace shattered. The enemy was not just watching, he was hunting. Ivy stood up, her mind already working, the shock being replaced by a cold, calculating anger. He'll be back. He'll be looking for proof. We have to give him something to find. Her eyes scanned the landscape, her gaze settling on the property line, marked by the corner posts they had reset. We need a new stake, a witness. They worked quickly. Holt found a length of seasoned pine with her knife. Ivy carved a small, almost invisible notch on the inside of the stake, a tiny L for larkspur. Then, she took a piece of pine sap from a nearby tree and carefully smeared it deep inside the notch. When he pulls this stake out to move it, she explained, her voice all business, the notch will scrape a sliver of wood from the post hole, and his hands will have pine sap on them. It's physical evidence. It places him at the scene of the crime. They planted the decoy stake, a silent, legal trap waiting to be sprung. As they rode back toward the main pasture, Holt began a slow, methodical count of his herd. The cattle were scattered, seeking the new shoots of grass the rain had brought forth. He counted once, he counted again. A cold knot formed in his stomach. "They're gone," he said, his voice hollow. 12 head, a dozen of my best heifers. They're gone. He rode to the break in the fence, the one that led to the adjoining pasture, the pasture he knew was being leased by a holding company for the rail range syndicate. The tracks in the mud were clear, a dozen sets of his cattle's hoof prints, being driven by a single, heavy-shod horse, Tolliver's horse. It was all connected. They stole the water to kill the grass, forcing his cattle to wander. Then, under the cover of the storm, they stole the cattle. It wasn't just a land grab anymore. It was a methodical strangulation. As they sat on their horses, staring at the tracks that led to the syndicate's land, a sound echoed across the newly washed valley. It was the train, on its way east. But the whistle was different. It wasn't the usual short, cheerful blast. It was one long, mournful, sustained cry. A signal. Ivy looked at Holt, her face pale. "That's a siding signal. It means the train is stopping at the private syndicate loading dock, not at the town depot." She clutched the leather case that held the stolen map. "Drager. He's moving the documents. He's sending all the forged papers, all the evidence of his crimes, back east. He's wiping the slate clean." The ticking clock they didn't know they were fighting against had just struck midnight. The Juniper Gulch Town Hall was not a hall at all, but a single, cavernous room that smelled of unseasoned pine, stale tobacco, and the collective anxiety of men pushed to their breaking point. It was suffocatingly hot. Every landowner in the valley with a deed and a debt had been summoned, and they packed the rough wooden benches, their faces grim, their Sunday clothes already looking wilted and out of place. At the front of the room, behind a long trestle table, sat the arbiters of their fate, Lydia Pike, looking cool and authoritative, the county sheriff, a portly man named Blevins, whose primary skill was avoiding trouble, and the town's preacher, a man whose sermons on patience were beginning to wear thin on a congregation of starving cattlemen. Holt Mercer stood alone in the open space before them. He was not invited to sit. He was the subject, the accused. Lydia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice carrying easily through the tense silence. "We are here to discuss a matter of community importance. The ongoing water shortage affects us all. But recently, certain irregularities have come to the bank's attention. Irregularities that suggest not all of us are sharing the burden equally." Her eyes, cold and direct, settled on Holt. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her tone a careful blend of concern and accusation. "It has been reported that while the rest of the valley's creeks run dry, a secondary, unmapped channel has appeared on your property, a channel that seems to be providing your land with a private supply." A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. Men who had been Holt's neighbors his entire life now looked at him with suspicion. In a drought, water was more than life. It was a religion. And this was an accusation of heresy. "There's no secret channel." "Lydia," Holt said, his voice flat and steady. My creek is as dry as any other. Is it? She countered smoothly. Sheriff Blevins, have you not received reports of nocturnal activity on the Coyote Ladder Ranch? Of suspicious digging, Sheriff Blevins cleared his throat, avoiding Holt's gaze. Well, now, there's been talk. Miss Pike, just talk. And what of the woman Lydia pressed, her voice sharpening like a knife? The town is buzzing with talk of a strange woman you are sheltering. A woman no one has seen, who comes and goes like a phantom. Who is she? Holt, what is her business on your land, a land that seems to be the focus of so much unusual activity? This was her play, to paint him as a hoarder, a cheat, and a man of secrets, to isolate him from his own community before she delivered the final blow. Before Holt could answer, a calm, commanding voice rose from the back of the room. That would be my business. Miss Pike. Amos Drager stepped forward from the shadows near the door. He was immaculate, a specter of wealth and power. He held a rolled document tied with a red ribbon. He walked to the front of the room with an unhurried, confident stride, placing the document on the table. "Forgive my intrusion," he said, his voice a polished baritone that commanded attention. "My name is Amos Drager. I am a consulting agent for the Rail Range Syndicate. The unusual activity you refer to is simply a preliminary survey. The syndicate, as you know, has a vested interest in the agricultural future of this valley." He untied the ribbon and unrolled the document with a flourish. It was a large, beautifully rendered map of the Ash Mesa watershed. In the corner was a large, official-looking red wax seal. "This," Drager announced, "is the syndicate's revised hydrological survey of the region, certified and sealed. It shows, quite clearly, that the primary aquifer does not, in fact, originate on Mr. Mercer's land as previously thought. It flows from the adjacent parcel syndicate land, and a small, naturally occurring fissure has simply redirected a minor portion of our water onto his property. We have been indulgent in allowing him this runoff, but our patience, like the water, is finite." The room was stunned into silence. It was a masterful stroke. The map, the seal, Drager's confident delivery. It was the word of God handed down from the railroad. Holt felt the floor drop out from under him. This was their checkmate. They had produced a document that made him the thief. Then, from the back of the room, a quiet voice spoke. "May I see that? Please." Every head turned. A woman was standing near the back wall, almost hidden in the shadows. She wore a simple, dark dress and a wide-brimmed bonnet that completely obscured her face. It was Ivy. She took a step forward into the aisle. Drager looked at her, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "And you are?" "A concerned citizen," Ivy said, her voice steady. "With a background in cartography. I would simply like to examine the document." Lydia scoffed. "This is an official survey. Madam, it is not for public debate, but a few of the ranchers, men who respected fairness above all, began to murmur." "Let her look. What's the harm in letting her look?" Drager, ever the picture of magnanimity, gave a slight bow. "But of course, the syndicate has nothing to hide." Ivy walked to the front, her steps measured and calm. She did not look at Holt. She pulled a small, powerful magnifying glass from her pocket and bent over the map. The room was utterly silent, the only sound the faint buzzing of a fly against a window pane. She spent a long minute tracing the lines, her face still hidden by the bonnet. Finally, she straightened up. "This is an impressive document, Mr. Drager," she said, her voice clear and precise. "It's an excellent forgery." A collective gasp went through the room. Drager's smile tightened at the edges. "The wax seal is authentic," Ivy continued, her voice gaining strength, "but it has been heated and reapplied. You can see the microscopic fractures in the wax bed. And the lines themselves, the surveyor's signature has been etched onto the plate with a chemical agent, not engraved with a burin. The upstrokes have the same weight as the downstrokes. It's a common forger's mistake." Wade Tolliver, who had been standing by the wall, took a menacing step forward. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, his hand dropping to his pistol. You come in here, hiding your face, making wild accusations." Ivy didn't flinch. She slowly raised her hands, not in surrender, but to the brim of her bonnet, with a single, deliberate motion. She pushed it back, letting it fall behind her shoulders. She lifted her head, and for the first time, the entire room saw her face, clear and defiant in the afternoon light. "My name is Ivy Larkspur," she declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell, "and I am the former senior records clerk of the Cheyenne Land Office, a position I was forced to resign after I refused to sign my name to this very same fraudulent document." The room erupted. Drager's face, for the first time, was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Lydia Pike looked as if she had been slapped. "She's lying," Tolliver bellowed. "Am I?" Ivy reached into her own satchel and pulled out a worn, rolled parchment. She spread it on the table beside Drager's. It was older, the lines faded, but it depicted the same land. "This is the original 1870 survey map from the county archive, the one that proves the water originates on the Coyote Ladder Ranch." She pointed a finger at the map, then out the window toward the distant hills, "and it proves something else. The law is very specific. The original survey marker for this quadrant must be placed one surveyor's chain 66 feet due south of the oldest cypress on that ridge. Your men, Mr. Tolliver, moved that marker 3 handspans to the west just last night." "That's a damn lie," Tolliver shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "Is it this time?" It was Holt who spoke. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Tolliver. He reached into his coat pocket and placed 3 items on the table, setting them down with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. First, a handful of machine-made nails with 9 rings on their heads. Second, a splinter of fresh-cut pine, marked with the curved grooves of a circular saw. "These are from the illegal dam your crew built in the county culvert." "Tolliver," Holt said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Then he set down the last item. It was the decoy survey stake they had planted. He held it up for all to see. "And this is the stake you pulled from my property this morning to move the marker." He ran his thumb over the small, almost invisible notch Ivy had carved. It was filled with a tiny, telltale sliver of wood. "You see, when you pulled this out of the post hole, it took a piece of the hole with it. A witness." He turned his gaze to Tolliver's hands. "And I'd be willing to bet that if you check your gloves, Sheriff, you'll find they have pine sap on them." Tolliver instinctively flinched, his hands balling into fists. It was a fatal, reflexive admission of guilt. The mood in the room had shifted completely. The suspicion that had been aimed at Holt was now a palpable wave of anger directed at the front table. Men were on their feet, shouting questions. "It's a lie, a conspiracy," Lydia cried, her voice shrill with desperation. "This woman is a disgraced clerk, and Mercer is a desperate debtor. They're trying to ruin us, but no one was listening to her." They were looking at the 2 maps, at the nails, at Tolliver's guilty face, and at Holt Mercer, who stood not as an accused man, but as a man who had brought the truth. The town mayor, a man who had been silent until now, finally stood up, his face pale but resolute. "That's enough," he shouted, banging the gavel until the room fell into a grudging silence. "These are serious allegations. There will be a formal, on-site verification of the survey markers tomorrow morning. At dawn, Sheriff, you will secure both of these maps as evidence." Drager didn't wait. He had already accepted defeat for the day. He stood up, his composure perfectly restored, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Tolliver. He looked at Holt, and then at Ivy, and his thin lips curled into a smile that was utterly devoid of warmth. It was a promise. He turned and walked toward the door, moving through the angry crowd as if they were nothing more than bothersome ghosts. As he passed Holt, he leaned in, his voice a sibilant whisper meant only for him and Ivy. "Enjoy your victory," he hissed, the words dripping with venom. "Because tonight, the creek changes its course one last time." Then he was gone, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the coming evening. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. Draeger's parting words had poisoned the air, leaving a residue of dread that was thicker than the night's chill. Holt and Ivy didn't return to the ranch house. They didn't dare. They made their way to a high, defensible ridge overlooking the dead, white expanse of Whisper Tank, the place where the valley's heart had been cut out. They were waiting for a war they knew was coming. Sleep was impossible. Holt sat with his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness, every shadow a potential threat. Ivy, wrapped in a blanket, appeared to be resting, but her stillness was that of a predator, coiled and alert. It was she who heard it first, a faint, rhythmic sound, carried on the night breeze. Chink, scrape, chink, the sound of a steel shovel striking stone. She was on her feet in an instant, her hand on Holt's arm. Listen, he heard it too. The sound was coming from the direction of the syndicate's illegal dam, the one they had blocked at the county culvert. It was the sound of men working hard and working fast. He wasn't bluffing, Holt said, his voice a low growl. He's making his final move. They moved without another word, two shadows detaching themselves from the rocks. They didn't take the horses. They crept along the jagged limestone ledge that bordered the arroyo, the terrain treacherous even in daylight. Below them, in the basin of Whisper Tank, a single lantern cast a pool of sickly yellow light, illuminating a scene of frantic destruction. Wade Tolliver was there, stripped to his undershirt despite the cold, his muscles straining as he directed a crew of 3 other men. They weren't building a dam. They were destroying one. With crowbars and shovels, they were tearing away the temporary earth and rock barrier that was still, by some miracle, holding back the last of the aquifer's deep water. They were opening the floodgates. But the water wasn't being released into its natural channel. It was being diverted into a deep, newly dug trench, a raw, ugly wound in the earth that led directly away from Holt's land and toward the vast, thirsty pasture the syndicate had leased. This was Draeger's masterstroke. By dawn, when the mayor and the verification party arrived, there would be no water left to argue over. Whisper Tank would be a dust bowl. The original creek bed would be bone dry, and the syndicate's new trench would be flowing with water they could claim had always been theirs. The crime would be complete, the evidence washed away. "We have to stop them," Holt whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle. "No," Ivy countered, her voice a fierce, controlled hiss. She was already fumbling in her satchel. "Stopping them isn't enough. We have to prove this. Right now. In the dark." She pulled out a small cloth pouch. It was filled with finely ground charcoal powder, the kind used for marking livestock. She also had a small, folded piece of oilcloth. She began to crawl forward, moving from rock to rock with a terrifying, silent grace. Holt followed, his rifle at the ready, his body a shield between her and Tolliver's men. She reached the edge of the embankment, directly above the work site. The men were too engrossed in their labor to notice. Ivy opened her pouch, with quick, deft movements. She sifted a fine layer of the black powder over the freshly cut edge of the trench, where the shovel marks were deepest. She dusted the area around a pile of discarded 9-ringed nails. Then, her eyes darting around, she spotted a clear boot print in the soft, damp earth, deeper than the others' Tolliver's. She carefully dusted the entire print, the black powder clinging to the moist soil, creating a perfect, dark record of his presence. "What are you doing?" Holt breathed. "Creating ghosts," she whispered back. "In the daylight, this is just dirt. But tonight, under the lantern light," she held up the oilcloth. The charcoal powder, when lit from an angle, would catch the light, revealing the texture of the shovel marks, the number of nails, the pattern on the boot's sole. It was photographic evidence, captured with the most primitive of tools. She had just finished dusting the boot print when one of Tolliver's men looked up to wipe the sweat from his brow. His gaze swept the darkness of the ridge. For a heart-stopping second, his eyes passed right over them. Then they snapped back. "Hey," he yelled, pointing. "Someone's up there!" All 4 men spun around, their shovels held like weapons. Tolliver's head jerked up, his face a mask of rage in the lantern light. "Mercer!" he roared. The chase was instant and chaotic. Holt grabbed Ivy's arm, pulling her back from the edge as Tolliver started scrambling up the loose rock and gravel of the embankment. "Run!" They sprinted back along the ledge, loose scree skittering under their boots, threatening to send them plunging into the darkness below. Tolliver was surprisingly fast, his rage lending him speed. Holt knew they couldn't outrun him on this terrain. Their only hope was the horses. They reached the spot where they'd left the animals tethered. Holt didn't waste a second. He untied Balthazar's reins, vaulted into the saddle, and wheeled the horse around in a tight, expert circle. "Ivy." Now he yelled. She was running toward him, but Tolliver was closing the distance, his face contorted in a snarl. Holt spurred Balthazar forward, galloping straight at her. It looked as if he were going to run her down. At the last possible second, he leaned far down from the saddle, his arm outstretched. "Grab on!" She reached up, her hand closing around his forearm in a desperate grip, in one fluid, powerful motion that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. Holt heaved her upward. She was airborne for a moment, a weightless figure in the dark, before she landed securely on the saddle behind him. Balthazar never broke stride. They thundered off into the night, leaving Tolliver standing alone, cursing in the darkness. They galloped hard, putting distance between them and Tolliver's crew. Holt pushed Balthazar toward the only landmark he knew would give them a tactical advantage, the old cinder trestle bridge, a high, rickety wooden span across a deep, impassable gorge. They reached it minutes ahead of their pursuers, the horses' hooves drumming a frantic rhythm on the wooden planks. On the far side, Holt reined Balthazar to a sharp halt. He slid from the saddle, pulling Ivy down with him. Behind them, they could hear the growing thunder of hoofbeats. Tolliver and his men were coming. "They've got us trapped," Ivy said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Not yet," Holt said, his eyes scanning the bridge. Tolliver and his crew appeared at the far end of the trestle, reining in their horses. For a moment, the two groups faced each other across the 100-foot span. Then Tolliver dismounted. He grabbed the lantern from one of his men and used it to light a piece of oil-soaked rag tied to a stick, a makeshift torch. He held it high, the flames casting huge, monstrous shadows against the gorge walls. "It's over." "Mercer," he yelled, his voice echoing in the canyon. "Give me the woman, and I'll let you ride out of here." When Holt didn't answer, Tolliver took a step onto the bridge and lowered the torch toward the dry, creosote-soaked timbers. "Or we can all just burn together." Holt knew he meant it. Tolliver would burn the bridge to the ground rather than let them escape. He looked at the planks beneath his feet, then at Tolliver. A desperate, insane gamble formed in his mind. "Ivy," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Your canteen, get it ready." He pulled a long, heavy pry bar from Balthazar's saddle rigging. "When I move, you douse that flame." He walked to the center of the bridge. "All right, Tolliver," he shouted. "You win!" He knelt, pretending to surrender. But as he knelt, he jammed the tip of the pry bar into the crack between two thick wooden planks. Tolliver watched, a triumphant sneer on his face. Holt put his entire weight on the bar. The old wood groaned in protest. A nail screeched as it was pulled free. Tolliver's sneer vanished. "What are you doing?" With a final, desperate heave, Holt ripped the entire 10-foot plank free from the bridge's frame. He kicked it sideways, into the gorge. It fell, tumbling end over end into the blackness below. Now, in the middle of the bridge, there was a gaping, 2-foot-wide hole, a trap. A horse would see it at the last second and rear, or try to jump and fail, breaking its leg and throwing its rider into the chasm. The bridge was impassable. At the exact same moment Holt kicked the plank free, Ivy acted. She ran forward a few steps and threw the contents of her canteen in a high, arcing spray. The water hit Tolliver's torch with a loud hiss, extinguishing the flame, plunging them back into near darkness. Tolliver roared in fury, but he was beaten. He was stranded on his side of the broken bridge. Then, a new figure emerged from the darkness behind him. Amos Drager, astride a magnificent black horse, moved forward with an unnerving calm. He wasn't looking at the bridge. He was looking at Holt. In his hand, he held a single sheet of paper, an impressive display of rustic ingenuity. "Mr. Mercer," Draeger said, his voice cutting through the night, but ultimately futile. He held up the paper. "While you have been playing your childish games, I have been engaged in business. This is a newly executed writ of seizure, signed by a circuit judge this evening. It seems your loan was sold by the bank. My employers are now the lien holders, and they have called the note due immediately. Your ranch, Mr. Mercer, is now the property of the Rail Range Syndicate. It was a brilliant final gambit, to ruin him not with force, but with the cold, irrefutable power of the law. But he had made one mistake. He had brought the document to Ivy. Let me see it," she called out, her voice clear and steady across the gorge. Draeger smiled. "By all means." He handed it to Tolliver, who carried it to the edge of the gap. Holt took it and passed it to Ivy. She held it up to the faint moonlight. "The embossed seal is flat," she said immediately. "A true press leaves a raised edge on the back of the paper. This was done with a hand crimper. A fake." She traced a line with her finger. "And the signature. See how the pressure never changes, how the ink is perfectly even. It's a dead signature. The judge didn't write this. Someone traced it." Suddenly, a shot rang out, the crack echoing through the gorge. It wasn't aimed at anyone. It was a warning shot, fired into the air. On the ridge above them, Sheriff Blevins and 2 deputies appeared, rifles in hand. Someone in town, seeing the torch and hearing the commotion, had ridden for the law. "That's enough," Blevins yelled. "Drop your weapons, all of you," at that exact moment. The sky, which had been clear, seemed to crack open. A sudden, violent downpour, the kind that can flood a canyon in minutes, began to fall. The rain hammered down, turning the dust to mud, and in the valley below, the water began to rise. The new trench, dug in soft earth, couldn't handle the flash flood. It collapsed. The makeshift dam, already weakened by Tolliver's sabotage, burst completely. A great surging wave of brown water, liberated and furious, ignored the syndicate's trench and roared back into its ancient, rightful channel, the dry creek bed of the Coyote Ladder Ranch. The water itself, a living, breathing witness, was returning home. Tolliver stared, his face a picture of disbelief, as the very thing he had tried to steal was taken from him by the sky itself. He dropped his gun and raised his hands. Draeger, however, was already moving. With a savage kick, he spurred his horse, turning and galloping back into the darkness from which he had come. In his haste, his leather satchel, heavy with wet documents, came unlatched. It fell to the muddy ground, unnoticed. The deputies scrambled down the ridge. They put the cuffs on a defeated, rain-soaked Wade Tolliver. Holt and Ivy just stood there, on their side of the broken bridge, as the rain washed over them, watching the impossible. Beautiful sight of water flowing, fast and free, through the heart of their land. The circuit court of Juniper Gulch convened in the house of God. The town's small church was the only building large enough to hold the weight of the moment, and the morning sun, slanting through the colored glass of the single-stained window, painted patches of ruby and sapphire light on the dusty floorboards. The pews were packed with the same ranchers from the day before, but their anger had been replaced by a tense, watchful silence. They were here not for a town meeting, but for a reckoning. At the front, the preacher's pulpit had been commandeered by a man whose presence seemed to fill the room. Judge Harlan Wade was a traveling circuit judge, a man with a reputation for sharp eyes and a sharper mind, who had been routed from his journey by Sheriff Blevins's urgent telegram. He sat, impassive and stern, his gaze missing nothing. Wade Tolliver sat on a front bench, flanked by 2 deputies, his wrists in irons. His face was a mask of sullen defiance. Lydia Pike sat alone, a few rows behind him, her fine dress looking out of place, her posture rigid, her face pale. Amos Draeger's chair was conspicuously empty. Holt and Ivy did not sit together. Holt stood near the side wall, his arms crossed, a silent, unmovable fixture. Ivy sat near the back, her bonnet on her lap, her satchel clutched in her hands. She looked small and unassuming, an illusion she was about to shatter. This court is convened to investigate serious allegations of fraud, property damage, and water theft. Judge Wade began, his voice a powerful baritone that needed no gavel to command silence. Sheriff Blevins has presented me with a preliminary account of last night's events at the Cinder Trestle and the fortuitous return of water to the Bitter Creek Arroyo. He looked down at the documents before him, including Drager's fallen satchel, which Blevins had placed on the pulpit as evidence. Miss Larkspur, you have been presented as the primary witness. Please approach. Ivy stood and walked to the front of the church. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at the judge. She placed her satchel on the witness stand, a small table they had brought in, and opened it. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and clear. This is not a simple dispute over a dry creek. This is a calculated, systematic campaign to bankrupt an entire valley. The crime has 4 parts: motive, method, action, and intent. She laid out the first piece of evidence. It was her copy of the 1886 brand book. The motive, Your Honor, is the land itself, made valuable by the cattle it can support. This book is the legal record of that value. The syndicate sought to acquire this value, not by purchase, but by engineered ruin. Next, she laid out the 2 maps, the original and Drager's forgery, side by side. The method was fraud at the highest level. This, she pointed to her scroll, is the original, legally filed survey map of this watershed. And this, she pointed to Drager's, is a forgery designed to invert reality. It legally erased Mr. Mercer's water rights and transferred them to the syndicate. As I stated yesterday, the seal is reapplied. The signature is a chemical etching. It is a lie on paper. She then reached back into her satchel. The action was sabotage, committed under the guise of civic improvement. She placed the splinter of pine and the 9-ringed nails on the table. These are from the illegal dam Wade Tolliver built, using county-contracted materials from his own lumber yard. To physically choke the creek and create the drought this forgery was designed to explain. Tolliver surged to his feet. She's a liar. There's no proof. Sit down. Mr. Tolliver, the judge ordered, his voice like cracking ice. Tolliver, under the heavy hand of a deputy, sank back onto the bench. Proof, Your Honor, Ivy said calmly, is a difficult thing to capture, especially when a crime is committed in the dark. But last night, Mr. Tolliver and his men attempted to destroy the final evidence of their crime by demolishing the headgate at Whisper Tank. She looked directly at the jury of ranchers. They were attempting to steal the last of your water. She then produced her small pouch of charcoal dust and the folded oilcloths. I had no camera, Your Honor, so I used what I had. She unfurled one oilcloth. It was black with dust. This is a dust lift of the shovel marks on the new trench. You can see the unique scalloped edge of the spade they used. She unrolled another. This is a lift of the boot print Mr. Tolliver left at the scene. As he supervised the destruction, she held it up. The pattern of the sole, the worn heel, the small, distinguishing nick in the leather, it was all there. A perfect black silhouette. I'm sure it will match the boots he is currently wearing. Every eye in the room went from the charcoal print to Tolliver's feet. He instinctively tried to tuck them under the bench. And this, Ivy said, her voice dropping, is the most critical piece. This is the survey marker Mr. Tolliver pulled from Mr. Mercer's property 2 days ago in an attempt to illegally redraw the boundary line. She held up the decoy stake. He did not know, however, that this stake was a trap. If you look closely inside this notch, she pointed with a pin, you will see a sliver of wood from the original post hole. And if you examine Mr. Tolliver's gloves, which the sheriff has in his possession from last night, you will find traces of the pine sap I placed inside that notch. It was a perfect, unbreakable chain. Every lie, every action, connected by a thread of meticulous, undeniable evidence. Ivy had not just accused them. She had dissected their crime for the entire town to see. She stood back, her presentation complete. The judge looked at the evidence, then at Tolliver, his face a grim mask. "Mr. Mercer," he said, turning his gaze to Holt, "do you have anything to add to this testimony?" Holt stepped forward. He was not a man of speeches. His entire life had been a testament to work, not words. He looked at the judge, but his words were for his neighbors, for the men on the benches who had doubted him. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "I'm not asking for charity. I'm not asking for damages." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the tired, worried faces of the other ranchers. "I'm just asking for the water to run where it's meant to, for everyone." He stepped back. He had said all he needed to say. Judge Wade then turned his formidable attention to Lydia Pike. "Miss Pike, this court is in possession of a satchel dropped by the fugitive, Mr. Drager. It contains a great deal of correspondence between him and your father's bank. It appears the bank was deeply in debt to a syndicate holding company. It also contains drafts of letters offering to forgive Mr. Mercer's debt in exchange for his land and water rights. Letters that threatened foreclosure if he refused." He held up a piece of paper. "This appears to be your handwriting. Can you explain this?" Lydia Pike, who had been a creature of pure, confident power, seemed to shrink. The color drained from her face. She looked cornered, her web of influence and intimidation gone. She looked at the hard faces of the ranchers, at the implacable judge, and at Holt, whose quiet integrity had defeated her. They had us," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The syndicate. My father made some bad investments. They owned us." "Drager said it was the only way. He said if we delivered the coyote ladder, the bank would be saved. He pressured me. It was a confession, wrung from her not by force, but by the simple, crushing weight of the truth." Judge Wade listened, his expression unchanging. He let the silence hang for a long moment. Then he delivered his judgment. "This court finds that a criminal conspiracy has been perpetrated against the landowners of this valley by the Rail Range Syndicate and its agents," he declared, his voice resonating with the authority of the law. "The revised survey map presented by Mr. Drager is hereby declared fraudulent and void. All water rights will revert to the specifications of the original 1870 survey." He turned to Tolliver. "Wade Tolliver, you are found guilty of willful destruction of property, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft. You are sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in the territorial prison." Tolliver slumped, a broken man. "A federal warrant is hereby issued for the arrest of Amos Drager on charges of fraud, bribery, and tampering with federal documents." The judge continued. "And this court orders the syndicate to pay full restitution to all ranchers for livestock lost or devalued as a result of this manufactured drought." He looked out at the crowd. "Furthermore, the county is ordered to immediately restore all property markers to their legal positions. The water of the Ash Mesa will be reapportioned according to the original deeds, ensuring a fair share for every landowner, large and small." For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Then, it was as if the entire valley let out a breath it had been holding for months. A low murmur of relief and disbelief swept through the pews. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cheering. It was the quiet, profound sound of hope being restored. Several of the ranchers, men who had looked at Holt with suspicion just a day before, slowly took off their hats, holding them in their hands. A few of them met his eyes and gave a slow, respectful nod. It was an apology, offered and accepted in the silent language of the West. The trial was over. Justice, rough and swift, had been done. As the crowd began to file out, Ivy gathered her evidence, the maps, the brand book, the splinter of wood, and handed it all to the court clerk. She kept nothing. Her work was done. As she turned to leave, she saw Holt standing by the church doors, waiting. Their eyes met across the emptying room. It was a look that acknowledged everything that had passed between them, the danger, the storm, the victory without a single word. The mayor bustled over to her, his face beaming. Miss Larkspur, that was the most remarkable thing I have ever witnessed. On behalf of the county, I would like to offer you a position. We are forming a new water oversight board. We need your expertise. We need your integrity. It was a chance to stay, a chance to have a home, a purpose, a name that was respected instead of whispered. But Ivy looked past the mayor, toward the open church doors and the hills beyond. "Thank you, Mayor," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But my work isn't finished. I will leave when every channel is restored to its rightful place, and every marker is back where it belongs." She walked toward the door, toward Holt. He stepped aside to let her pass into the bright, clean sunlight. As she did, he spoke, his voice low, meant only for her. "If you leave," he said, "then take a reason to come back." The sun was a melting pattern of gold, pouring its last warmth over the high, rugged crest of Widow's Spur. Holt Mercer drove the final survey stake into the damp, dark earth. The sound of the sledgehammer hitting the iron was a clean, ringing note of finality. A full stop at the end of a long, ugly sentence. He stood, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and listened. It was a sound he thought he might never hear again. The quiet, cheerful music of running water. Below him, the Bitter Creek arroyo, no longer a dry scar, gurgled and sang as it made its way over the stones. It was a sound of life, of a promise kept. He watched the small, clear stream, the lifeblood of his land, of the entire valley, flowing exactly where it was meant to flow. It was a sight that filled a hollow space inside him he hadn't known was there. The land was healing, and maybe so was he. He saw her then, a lone figure riding slowly up the trail from the valley floor. Ivy. She moved with a weariness that was deep in her bones, but her back was straight. She reined in her horse a respectful distance away and dismounted. In her hand, she held a small, folded piece of yellow paper, a telegram. She walked toward him, her steps slow, her boots making soft prints in the newly damp earth. She stopped a few feet away, the space between them a familiar, practiced habit. She held out the telegram. "It's from Cheyenne," she said, her voice quiet. "From the territorial governor's office. I sent them my testimony, along with copies of the evidence. They opened an inquiry." She took a deep, shaky breath. "The embezzlement charges have been expunged from my record. My name has been cleared. It's over." Holt felt a profound sense of relief wash over him, a relief that was entirely for her. She had won. She had gotten her name back. She was no longer a ghost, a fugitive hiding behind a false name in a dusty room. She looked around, at the setting sun, at the flowing water, at him. Her face was a complex map of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and a deep, lingering uncertainty. The fight was over, but the instincts of a soldier remained. A faint, sad smile touched her lips as she looked back toward the valley, where a few lamps were beginning to glow in the twilight. "We still can't be seen together," she whispered. The words came out automatically, a reflex born of weeks of terror and concealment. The habit of fear was a deep-cut canyon, and she was still standing on its edge. Holt didn't answer with words. He looked at her, at the residual fear in her eyes, and he smiled. It was a slow, genuine smile that eased the hard lines around his own eyes. Then, with a deliberate slowness that was filled with meaning, he began to disarm. First, he pulled off his heavy leather work gloves, the ones that were stained with the dirt of his land and the sweat of his fight. He tucked them into his belt. He was removing the calloused shield he showed the world. Next, he untied the dusty, faded bandana from around his neck. It was a tool he used to ward off the dust, to hide his face from the sun and the prying eyes of the town. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He was done hiding. He took a single step toward her, closing half the distance that had always separated them. He was an open book, a man with nothing left to conceal. Ivy watched him, her breath catching in her throat. The symbolic weight of his small actions was as powerful as any speech. A tremor of emotion, half laughter, half sob, ran through her. "You've already started undressing," she murmured, the words a fragile mix of humor and awe. Holt's smile deepened. He looked directly into her eyes, and in their depths, she saw the storm she had first glimpsed on the day they met, but now it was a storm that had passed, leaving a quiet, powerful stillness in its wake. "Not to show off," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. "To stay." He took another step, closing the final gap between them. In front of everyone, he reached out, not to touch her face or her shoulder, but her hand. He took it in his own. His skin was rough, but his touch was gentle. Her fingers, so used to clutching maps and evidence, curled around his. It was not a desperate grasp, but a quiet, firm acknowledgement. A partnership forged in darkness, now brought into the light. Together, without another word, they began to walk down the trail, hand in hand, leading their horses behind them. As they neared the main path that ran along the creek, they saw they weren't alone. A few of their neighbors, the same men who had sat in judgment at the church, were out with their own shovels. They weren't working on their own land. They were working together, reinforcing a weak spot in the main channel's bank, building a small rock wall to ensure the water was shared by all. They were healing the community, stone by stone. One of the men, a rancher named Silas, whose land bordered Holt's, looked up. He saw them. He saw their linked hands. He saw the way they walked together, not as strangers, but as two halves of a whole. A slow, knowing smile spread across his weathered face. He didn't say a word. He just lifted his chin in a nod of profound, simple respect. Another man saw, and he, too, nodded. The curse was broken. The town, which had once been a web of suspicion and fear, was now a witness to their bond. And it approved. They walked the rest of the way to Holt's ranch house in a comfortable silence. The front door, where a foreclosure notice had once been a harbinger of doom, now stood open, a welcoming invitation. The sound of the creek, his creek, their creek, was a constant, soothing presence. Inside, the house felt different. It was no longer just a shelter, a place of solitude and memory. It felt like a home. The air was warm, and Holt lit a single lamp, its golden glow pushing back the last of the twilight shadows. He turned to her in the warm, quiet kitchen. The outside world, with its laws and its ledgers, faded away. There was only the soft lamplight, the murmur of the creek, and the woman standing before him. He raised his other hand, cupping her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. It was the sound of a battle finally ending, of a soul coming home to rest. They stood like that for a long, silent moment, simply breathing each other in. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the line shack, born of desperation and the storm. This was a kiss of quiet certainty, of promises whispered without a single word. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sunrises, of fences mended together, of a future built on the solid ground of a truth they had fought for and won. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and she melted against him, her own arms circling his neck. They held each other, a long, deep embrace that was both a reunion and a beginning. Her head rested on his shoulder, his cheek against her hair. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, a soft, healing shower on the thirsty land. The lamplight flickered, its flame growing smaller, softer, until the room faded to a warm, peaceful dark. Outside, in the new night, the water flowed, clean and true, through the heart of the Coyote Ladder Ranch. It washed away the dust and the doubt, nurturing the dry earth, bringing life back to a valley that had been bled dry by greed. That was the most beautiful revenge of all, not the punishment of the guilty, but the restoration of the innocent, justice flowing like a river. "We can't be seen together," she had once said, a warning born of fear, but in the vast, open heart of the West, a love forged in truth and courage no longer needed to hide in the shadows. Thank you for listening to this story. We're so grateful to have you here with us. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people.